hope that's a useful explanation.
Yeah, it's actually, I think about it, and I think it makes for a very, I mean, if you bring the characters even more to light, it probably would have been if we were thinking about it. But Kobe, you were going to say something earlier.
It was pretty much a different take on the same thing, a different answer. I find for myself, I do think of the audience, but only in the sense that I try and write the audience or their reality at least into the text. So that's one part of what I do when I'm writing, where I tend to think of myself as writing primarily for the Ghanaian audience. However, I also feel like humanity is humanity, and so the things that matter to some extent, once you tap into certain universal truths, anyone can empathize with those things from anywhere in the world. And so when you write your characters well, you provoke empathy, and so you can use that to then go off and explore different things, different realities, different settings, the weird, the mundane, everything. So I think of the audience in the sense that I'm trying to write reality that would appear real to the audience. But I'm not a slave to it necessarily, I just think it's a reflection of good writing.
Okay, so back to the conversation direction. And toward the end, Shuma, I'll ask you to just share with the audience some of the things that you think we need to know about what you are engaged in right now at the venue. So just keep that in mind for the end. In the meantime, if you can just proceed. Any question, any direction that you follow from there?
I did want to ask a question. I mean, just to fellow writers, really. Do you ever sit down? I'm following on from what Shuma said about his characters and wanting to tell their story and finding their character, finding the story to tell through them. Do you ever have situations where the characters you create often misbehave and take you to somewhere you probably didn't think you were going?
Absolutely, that happens all the time. And in fact, my main writing folder is called Gems, because I take up that approach that nothing is really wrong. You know, I like stubborn characters who have their stories and who break my conception of what they want to say. And so a lot of times, my stories, actually I'm trying to keep myself awake. So they tend to take that I didn't know. So I've always had that, in fact, the more surprising it is for me, the more successful the story. But what is even more interesting is when I start out a story with trying to preach a certain moral, if I can use that term. And then I end up saying the opposite because in the course of writing the story, I've educated myself about the issues involved. So I find it makes for more nuanced storytelling. When you start out with a big conception about a certain state of events and you want to preach a certain moral, only to go halfway through the story and find out that you were being quite hubristic, you know, and that the truth lays somewhere in the middle. So I find that those nuanced storytelling make for more empathetic reading from readers who are right down the spectrum of morality that you were trying to preach in the first place.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. My characters are just like the very epitome of exactly what you just described, in terms of being troublesome and naughty and just deviating. But I think ultimately, there was a book that I read as an early writer, maybe around university, called The Art of Creative Writing by Lajas Egro. And in it, what he was saying is that all great characters have some kind of major flaw or insecurity. And the reason why we associate with these characters is because flaws and insecurities are the things that make us the most human. And so we are able to then connect. And so writing in that sense becomes an exercise in empathy and trying to kind of evoke empathy. Not even trying to. If you write well, then your characters will evoke empathy, and then they will seem true. So yeah, that's what it. So I think when I'm approaching my writing, I find that the more that I empathize, and as Chumo was saying, you start out with some kind of thing that you want to say, but then the characters will just take you in a completely different direction because you are treating the characters real and you're empathizing, and so you think very long and hard about their motivations, etc., etc., and that will send you in different directions.
And of course, nobody, well, that's how you generate empathy, because nobody's perfect. Nobody wants to read a story. Nobody wants to read a story about, let's say, for example, a multi-millionaire football player who's got everything he wants, to a certain extent. But the way we empathise is by seeing those flaws, and very often the characters themselves can't see the flaws, and that's what's interesting sometimes. From a writer's perspective, to kind of show the readers those weaknesses, and show, because there are blind spots, our weaknesses sometimes are, and we can't really see ourselves fully. Yeah.
I was going to also that one of the things is that it's not to define new human experience. People who know the story, traditional to us, they were told story, not the story. The oral, but written for every audience. And so you had the audience, your company, stay the same. Every night you tell this actor a little our short story now have universal. They are exactly the word, they are arranged word for word, pause for pause, comma for comma, and they are told the same everywhere. So to that extent, we find out that the reading, when you're even producing a short story for an audience, when you're delivering it, the nuance and changes. Sometimes if you are addressing children, you may skip over certain words that were designed for or adult audience after all. So in that sense, I find that the short story is actually a life story. And I'm trying to tell the story sometimes without reading it. And I found that that dynamic comes back, the dynamic of the conformity. So that's something that we rarely think about, the difference between a told story and a short story. But it's an interesting distinction to me.
Okay, so at this point, our audience has been very calming and obedient. So I'd like to know if there are any questions or any contributions from the crowd, so that we can join in. Any questions?
I have a question about whether as writers, like how their process changes from when they're writing short stories to when they're writing long form stories. Like what's the difference in their writing process?
Okay, so the question is how your process or your writing process alters depending on the length. In other words, if you're writing a novel, what are the considerations that get lost or get added versus when you're writing a short story, right? And so, is it the same sort of considerations that inform that writing, or does it change?
Who's the question for?
Anyone?
So the question is to anyone, but before I continue, anyone who has joined the call is also welcome to type the question in the chat section, and I'll read it for our panelists to answer. So in the meantime, the question about the novel and the short story.
Okay, yeah, let me. For me, when I write a short story, actually an excuse not to write a novel. I find out that it's faster for me to drop, but for a novel I need to plan the time, I need to plan the work, and I need to do a lot of reading to bring myself emotions. With the short story, I jump right in. I start in the middle, I start with the joke, I start with the end, whatever. And for me, it's a more spontaneous, and it's a much more fulfilling process, because I quickly get the job done and start the polish, which is where it really becomes a gem. So the process is definitely different. A lot of times with a novel, when I get an idea for the novel, all I'm going to do is to write a sketch, an idea, a concept, but I never get into the whole thing at the time.
Kobe, do you have any experience with writing novels? I'm working one at the moment, but I don't know. I don't really know what difference is. I've never attempted a full novel, but just Kobe, have you?
Apologies, I've been joined by my son who just woke up, so I'm going to slightly out of time.
You should totally join us.
Why don't you say hi?
I'm trying. He just woke up, so he's
There's no apologies needed.
So I have no experience writing for novels. I'm in the middle of trying to get started on. I've had ideas that I've wanted to expand into novels, and then some of them I've held on to for a very long time. And then very recently realized that some of my ideas for novels come from the idea that to write, one must write the novel. And then also just realizing recently that the novel is not the be-all and end-all. For some people, they use short stories as a stepping stone towards writing novels. Whereas I think for others, at least for myself, I've come to realize that these really are different formats, and there's an incredible skill and nuance that it takes to write short stories. Not everyone who writes novels, I feel, is a great short story writer, and vice versa. And so I think that, for me personally, I know of people, I think particularly of the Kwani Collective in Kenya, and how there was a time period where there were a lot of people who were writing short stories straight out of the mess that they had. And then they kind of graduated in novels, and so that was put forward as that's the path. But then I realized after some time that you can write short stories and that's that, and it's fine. So I've not gone there yet, but I may yet go there.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from the chat which says, if a short story is more about what you leave out and less about what you put in, how do you decide what to leave out? That's still the same question.
In the first place. Because you'll end up taking it out later anyway. It's part of it's this is basically what we sit down to do when we write a short story. Do I leave this in? Is it relevant, or do I take it out? And that's what you spend most of your time doing. Well, what I spend most of my time doing anyway. Very often I finish a first draft, and then it's not until I get to the end that I realise the story that I've written, and then I go back, and that's when I start taking things out. Bits that don't actually fit in with the story I've got. I think that kind of comes in the editing process, certainly in my experience.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Chuma, please.
I wanted to say that for me, I actually have the opposite problem. My short stories tend to be much more cryptic than normal. They are very bare bones. And I think this comes from my training as a lawyer. We tend to be very verbose in law. We are saying everything possible so we don't get misunderstood. Our contracts are extremely long, so that's the training. And I'm in horror. I actually am terrified by the possibility of being boring my listeners or boring my readers. So I tend to err on the side of being extremely succinct when I write. My readers do not agree. Maybe some might think I write too much, but my tendency is to have fewer words on the page. So my writing process tends to be extremely surgical in terms of I do my revisions, my content before the story is finished. So that at the end of the day, I'm actually adding words I feel that have to be there to tell the story more fully. So I think that my own experience has been slightly different from where I've approached the short story from.
Okay. Hello? Yeah, okay, so we have a last question, after which, Chuma, you will have a minute to tell us a bit more about the NSAS, just anything that you think we should know as an audience that is rooting for you and anyone who's engaging in the process. So we'll have a question there.
To me, Chuma sounds like it's easy for him to write short stories because he writes, he has experience in writing a novel. I want to find out from the others if they suffer writer's block because it's a short story, so I'm thinking, okay, 2-3 pages, so I want to know if they suffer.
In other words, is it easy to write a short story? Okay, they are laughing. I think that is a good answer.
Was somebody answering that?
Okay, well, I think you all answered this. So please come in, and then Chuma, when you are done, then you can talk about NSAS and then we'll close. Sorry, I was saying you could answer the question more fully, and then from there you could talk about NSAS and then we will close.
Okay, one of the most difficult things I've done, but it's also the most pleasurable because when you have, 100,000 words to tell a story, you get everything, you say it eventually. But if you limit yourself to 1,000 words to tell a story, then you have to pull it out, And so it's, sometimes I do 20 drafts of one story. So it's not easy, but when you do it well, it's the most fulfilling thing you can do. So to jump swiftly to the NSAS, for many years, for decades actually, the police has been very brutal in their handling of young people. It's almost as if the police is, not just the police, but a particular unit of the police called the SARS, the anti-robbery squad. Now, the special anti-robbery squad of the police. They are all over the country and they tend to have been a lot of extrajudicial killing. There's been a lot of, it's not exclusive to the SARS or the police. It's actually, we have a lot of disappearances attributed to the secret police, a lot of extrajudicial killing attributed to the army, But the SARS is the one that has the most interface in the general public. There have been lots of stories of disappearances, killings, and extortion right across the country. People that have been southern part, or really across the country. And it has triggered the extent of maybe everything of unity that has not been there before. So Gandhi for the project continue now. It's caused a lot of pullback from the public, and the government has had to make a lot of concessions, and they have been forced to stand. So I think people should look out. People should watch how things are happening, and it's starting in Nigeria.
Thank you, and thank all of you for your participation. Okay, so in case you
We're reading in Ghanaian languages here, so if you want to translate in about 5 minutes. Yeah,